My daughter's wedding was the most expensive day of my life. Not because I paid for it, because of what it cost me just to sit there and smile. Her new in-laws placed me at a table in the very back of the reception hall, right beside the kitchen doors, next to the exit, the father of the bride. Later, I found out her new mother-in-law had told the wedding planner, and I quote, "Keep the poor father out of the photos." I sat at that table for 4 long hours, listening to people laugh, watching strangers celebrate my daughter like I didn't belong there at all. Then I watched my daughter share the father-daughter dance with her new father-in-law, not because she wanted to, because her new family had already decided I was an embarrassment. And through all of it, I never said a word. Not at the wedding, not during the speeches, not even when people looked past me like I was part of the furniture. I stayed quiet. But 3 days later, everything changed. The newlyweds were still at the reception venue, hosting another family celebration, when a man walked into the lobby carrying a thick black folder. He asked for my son-in-law by name. When my son-in-law came downstairs, the man handed him the folder and quietly said something that made the color drain from his face. What happened over the next 6 minutes changed everything. The wedding, the family, and the way they thought money worked in this world. Stay right here. Welcome to Proven Right Stories. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe. Because on this channel, the people they underestimate, the people they push into the corner, always end up having the final word. Every single time. So get comfortable, grab a coffee, or something warm. Because today's story, it's got a wedding. A lonely table in the back corner of the room. A family obsessed with status. And a lawyer who walked in at exactly the right moment. And when he did, everything changed. Let's get into it. My name is Carl Donovan. I'm 58 years old, and I want to be honest about something most people in my position never say out loud. I wasn't born with money. For most of my life, I barely had any at all. I grew up in rural Tennessee. My father drove a school bus. My mother cleaned vacation cabins during tourist season and worked at a grocery store the rest of the year. We weren't the kind of poor that makes headlines. We were the ordinary kind. The kind where you learn, very young, that certain things just aren't meant for people like you. And after a while, you stop wanting them, because wanting things you can't afford has its own kind of hurt. I left home when I was 18 with an old truck that burned oil and $200 my mother had hidden away in an envelope inside the kitchen drawer. And I need you to understand something about that. I started with absolutely nothing. What I built over the next 35 years still feels strange to talk about sometimes. Not because I'm ashamed of it, but because I spent so many years being the man who had nothing, that even now, the version of me who has something still feels unfamiliar every once in a while. I work in commercial real estate investment, not the flashy kind you see in movies, the real kind. Conference rooms, contracts stacked 6 inches thick, long hours, patience, and years of learning how to recognize a good deal before anybody else sees its value. I'm not famous. You won't find me on magazine covers or rich lists online, but I live comfortably now. Comfortably in a way my parents would have thought was almost impossible. And I've always been careful about that. Very careful. I don't dress like a wealthy man. I don't talk about money at dinner tables. And I still drive a truck. Not because I can't afford something else. Because that truck reminds me who I was before any of this happened. I've never wanted to become the kind of man who mistakes appearances for character or money for worth. And that truck, that one simple choice, is what started everything at my daughter's wedding. My daughter's name is Ellie. She's 29 years old, and she is, without question, one of the best things I've ever done with my life. She met her husband, Marcus, about 3 years before the wedding. And Marcus is a good man. Steady, thoughtful, the kind of man who listens when people speak. More importantly, he looks at Ellie the way a husband should look at his wife. Like he still can't believe he got this lucky. Like she still surprises him. And after all these years together, he's not tired of that feeling yet. I liked Marcus from the very beginning. I want to make that clear. This story is not about him. It's about his mother. Patricia Voss was 61 years old. She was married to Marcus's father, Gerald, who built a regional chain of hardware stores throughout the Carolinas back in the 80s and 90s. They eventually sold the company in 2004 for an amount of money that isn't mine to discuss. But what I can tell you is this. Patricia spent the next 20 years becoming the kind of person who judged everyone by appearances. What they drove, what they wore, which neighborhood they lived in, which country club they belonged to. To Patricia, those things told you everything you needed to know about a person. And the moment Ellie and Marcus got engaged, She took one look at me and made up her mind about who I was. My truck parked in the driveway, my flannel shirt, my Tennessee accent. That was enough for her. And she wasn't subtle about it either. At the engagement dinner, she asked me what I did for work 3 separate times. Not because she was curious, because she had already decided what the answer probably was and wanted me to confirm it for her. I told her I worked in real estate. She nodded politely. You know the kind of nod I mean. The kind people give when they're pretending to care about something they've already dismissed. Ellie noticed it immediately. My daughter notices everything. But she didn't say anything. Because she was in love. And hopeful. And 29 years old. And like most people in love, she believed that eventually, everyone would figure things out and get along. The wedding was held in April, just outside Charlotte, North Carolina. It was beautiful. Huge venue. Perfect gardens. String lights everywhere. The kind of wedding people spend a year and a half planning, and more money on than I spent buying my first house. The Voss family paid for almost all of it. I offered to contribute more than once. But Patricia kept telling Ellie, "Oh, we've got it handled. Your father shouldn't worry about any of this." At the time, it sounded generous. Later, I realized what she was really doing. She was making sure the wedding belonged to them. You could see it in the seating chart alone. The Voss family and all their friends, business associates, country club couples, people with expensive watches and carefully practiced smiles, were seated front and center, close to the dance floor, close to the head table, exactly where every camera in the room would naturally point. Me? I was seated at table 14, back corner of the reception hall, right beside the kitchen service doors. Every few minutes, waiters pushed through carrying dirty dishes and trays of champagne. At my table was Ellie's aunt from her mother's side, 2 old friends of mine who had driven up from Tennessee for the day, and a 91-year-old cousin nobody seemed to know what to do with. The father of the bride. Table 14. I sat down, and I kept my mouth shut. I ate the food. I smiled when people looked my way, and when my daughter walked down the aisle. I cried the way fathers do when they're trying very hard not to let anybody see it. At the reception, Patricia gave a speech. She mentioned Marcus's family 7 different times. She mentioned Ellie 3. She never mentioned me. Not once. And I remember watching Ellie while Patricia spoke. My daughter kept her face perfectly calm, perfectly polite. But I knew that expression. She's had it since she was little. It's the face she makes when something hurts her, and she doesn't want me to know it hurt. She got that from me. What neither of us knew at the time was that Patricia had already gone even further. The morning of the wedding, she pulled the photographer aside, a woman named Dana, and gave her very specific instructions. The professional photos, the framed ones, the pictures that would get mailed to relatives and hung in living rooms for the next 30 years, were not supposed to include the father of the bride unless Ellie specifically asked for it. And according to Dana, Patricia's exact words were, "Keep the poor father out of the photos." 6 weeks later, Dana told Ellie the truth. Ellie called me that same night. She cried for almost 40 minutes. I never said a bad word about Patricia. Not once. I just told my daughter that what mattered was that I had been there, that I had seen her smile when she walked down the aisle, that no photograph in the world could take that memory away from me. And I meant every word I said. But after we hung up that night, I called my attorney. My attorney's name is Robert Hale. He's been handling my legal affairs for the last 16 years. And I called him after the wedding not because I wanted to sue anybody. I need to make that very clear. This was never about revenge. It was about something else. Because Patricia had done more than insult me with seating charts and photographs. 6 months before the wedding, Ellie and Marcus had come to me about a piece of property in the mountains outside Asheville. 60 acres. Beautiful land. Good timber. A creek running along the southern edge. Quiet. Private. The kind of place that grows more valuable every single year if you're patient enough to hold on to it. They dreamed about building a home there someday. A real home. The kind you raise children in. I told them I would take care of the purchase as a wedding gift. Marcus, not fully understanding my financial situation, mentioned the property to his mother during a conversation. And Patricia, who had already decided I was just some struggling man from Tennessee with an old truck and a flannel shirt, made a decision. Without telling anybody, she contacted the property owner directly. She told him I wasn't a serious buyer, that I didn't have the financial resources to close the deal, and that she would be interested in buying the land herself as a gift for Marcus and Ellie. In other words, she tried to purchase the property out from under me because she assumed I couldn't afford it. She never told Marcus. She never told Ellie. And what Patricia didn't know was that I had already signed the purchase agreement 7 weeks earlier. That contract was sitting safely in Robert Hale's files. 3 days after the wedding, Robert drove to the Voss family estate outside Charlotte, where the post-wedding celebrations were still going on. Now, Robert doesn't look impressive at first glance. He's 63 years old, owns maybe 3 suits total, and rotates them like clockwork. Drives a sedan older than my truck. He looks like the kind of man people overlook, which is usually a mistake. He walked into the house, introduced himself to the staff, and asked if Marcus Voss was available. Then he waited quietly in the lobby. When Marcus came downstairs, Robert shook his hand and calmly explained that he represented Carl Donovan, Marcus's father-in-law, and that there was some information involving a property transaction Marcus needed to see. Then Robert opened the folder. Inside was the signed purchase agreement, dated 7 weeks before Patricia had ever contacted the seller. My signature at the bottom. After that, Robert showed him the email trail, the phone records, even the seller's written statement confirming that Patricia had tried to convince him I wasn't financially credible. And then Robert told Marcus something that changed the entire conversation. He told him what the property was actually worth, not the purchase price, the real value. Marcus stood there in that lobby for a long moment without saying a word, just staring down at the paperwork in his hands. Finally, he looked up at Robert and asked one question. "Does Ellie know?" And Robert answered, "She will when you tell her. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that what happened afterward was neat and easy, because it wasn't." Marcus confronted his mother that same night, and from what I was later told, it was a very long conversation. Ellie found out everything at once. The photographer instructions, the comments behind her back, the attempt to interfere with the property purchase. All of it. And after that night, she didn't speak to Patricia for 4 months. Marcus told me later that when his mother finally tried to explain herself, she said she thought she was protecting the family. She believed I was in over my head. She believed I had made promises I couldn't keep. And she didn't want Ellie embarrassed by a father who might fail publicly. In other words, she made assumptions about a man she never actually tried to know. And every single assumption she made was wrong. Now, I want to tell you where things stand today. The land outside Asheville closed exactly on schedule. The deed is in Ellie and Marcus's names now. And it turned out to be exactly what I promised them it would be. A beginning. Ellie and Patricia eventually rebuilt some kind of relationship. Not the same relationship they had before. Something quieter, more honest. Some trust, once broken, doesn't grow back the same way. But that doesn't mean nothing can grow in its place. And Marcus, to be fair to him, handled the entire situation with more maturity than a lot of men twice his age ever could have. He didn't force Ellie to move on. He didn't pretend none of it happened. And he didn't make his wife choose between her husband and her mother-in-law. He simply insisted that the truth be acknowledged by everyone involved. That sounds simple. It isn't. And he did it anyway. As for Patricia, about 8 months after the wedding, she called me herself. No dramatic speech. No excuses. No performance. She just said, "I made assumptions about you that I had no right to make. And I'm sorry for what I did." And I told her, "I know. And I appreciate the call." That was the entire conversation. Because after 58 years on this earth, here's what I've learned. An apology doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't magically undo humiliation, or disappointment, or hurt. But it does tell you something important about a person. It tells you who they become after they realize they were wrong. And the woman who picked up the phone that day, the woman who spoke plainly and honestly without hiding behind excuses, was not the same woman who put me at table 14. Maybe not completely different, but different enough to matter. Now I want to ask you something. If you had been sitting at that back corner table, knowing the truth about yourself, knowing nobody else in that room saw your real worth, would you have spoken up right there in the moment? Would you have stood up and corrected everyone? Or would you have done what I did? Stayed quiet, watched carefully, and let the truth arrive in its own time, carried in by a quiet man, with a folder in his hand, and an old car parked outside? Tell me in the comments. I really want to know what you would have done. And if this story reminded you of a time someone underestimated you, or underestimated someone you love, send this story to them today. Because some people learn that lesson early, and some people need a man with a folder to explain it to them. I'll see you in the next story.